What's up YouTube, Dedrock here, bringing the video today, and today we're going to be doing episode 2 of how to become a Yugi Pro. Our lesson today is card advantage. First thing to know is what card advantage is, but first I want to do a little disclaimer. The way I look at card advantage is going to be very different from the way another player looks at card advantage. Now, when I think of card advantage, I think strictly for the cards that I control compared to my cards my opponent controls. That is very important to note in this video, because the way I look at activating a certain card is going to be different than a way if I was just looking at my own card advantage or my own amount of cards in hand, compared then when I compare it to my opponent. Just keep that in mind, guys. This is completely just comparing my cards to my opponent's cards. Okay, perfect. Let's get into this. First off, we'll talk about what card advantage is, and card advantage is one player having more cards than the other player to use. This includes all cards in the hand and on the field. Usually we don't include graveyard in these things, and that's just because we can't really do anything unless there's a special effect we can use in the graveyard, like reincarnation, but most of the time we don't count that unless we're really looking at into the future and kind of stuff like that. So now, usually card advantage is what leads to one player beating another player. It's just so important to have more cards to be able to outlast and react with your opponent and just still have plays for the next turn. So this is why like a deck like Sky Striker, which has a card like Engage, which literally allows you to go +1 every time you activate it if you have 3 or more spells in your graveyard. It's just absolutely just nuts. So now that we know what card advantage is, we need to know how it works. Card advantage throughout the duel determines who has the upper hand because they have more cards to make plays with than the other player. Here are some examples of how you can determine card advantage. The effect of Pot of Desire says that I can draw 2 cards. I've heard many people say since they are drawing 2 cards, they are going +2 in card advantage. This is not true. Pot of Desires makes us banish 10 cards from the top of our deck and draw 2. Now, since the cards we banish for Pot of Desires are not in hand or on field, they are banished from the deck, they do not count towards card advantage. But we had to use Desires, so that is now a -1 card. But I draw 2 cards, so it becomes a +1 since I have 1 more card than before, which gives me now +1 in card advantage compared to my opponent, because he would only have 5 cards. Now let's say Ash Blossom negates Pot of Desires by discarding itself. Some players would say you go -1, but in reality, you're actually going even because your opponent is now losing a card and you are losing a card. Now, some players may say that negating Pot of Desires is going to be a -1 for the player who activates Pot of Desires, but this is not the case. Both players are going to have 4 cards. Some players now consider that you're going to be going -1 going into the next turn because your opponent gets a draw, which is true. But in sheer terms of card advantage at that time, you are actually just going even since your opponent discards Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. So now we'll move on to the next example. If we activate MST destroying a spell or trap card, we use 1 card to get rid of 1 card, so it is actually going even, and that is called a 1-for-1. Now say we're using Twin Twister, which destroys 2 back row but at the cost of 1 card in hand. Since we pay the cost of a card, we are using 2 cards to get rid of 2 cards, which causes us to go even with our opponent. Let's talk a little bit about monster summoning. So actually, tribute summoning usually leads up to a -1, or a -2 if you're using 2 monsters to tribute summon. This is because you lose 1 card in hand for the monster that you're tribute summoning, but you're also losing monsters on the field, and you only gain 1 monster on the field for at least 1 monster. This is why tribute summoning in the game usually ends up being not very powerful, and people don't really want to do it because it ends up being a -1. Now, you can apply the same logic to both Fusion, Synchro, and XYZ summons. But you can't apply the same logic to Link summoning. Link summoning works a little bit different because we have a Link rating. When you use cards to make a Link 2 monster, you do go negative, but since your monster has a Link rating of 2, it's like having 2 cards, since it can be used to climb the Link ladder, giving Links a little bit of specialty in this area. Best players will try to stick with cards that allow them to either gain advantage or even go in order to help them to win the duel. The reason card advantage is so important is the more cards you have over your opponent, the more you're going to be able to outgrind your opponent and just play better in the long run. Alright guys, so that's pretty much all you need to know for card advantage. Now use this logic to always put yourself in the best position you possibly can by always playing for card advantage, and use this as logic for what cards you should and should not be playing. Always use cards that are either gaining you card advantage or at least going even at the very least. Alright guys, please comment, like, subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will talk to you later. See ya.